Hello everyone and welcome back. If you're new here, hi, I'm Saskolinas and today we're going to draw some tulips. So grab your pen and paper and let's start drawing with me. First, I'm using my pencil to sketch out rough guidelines for these three tulips that I'm seeing. I'm using this for reference, which you can also use. It will be linked down below. It's free to use. I'm focusing from this for reference on the first three tulips that I'm seeing. There's more of them in the background, but they're not that visible. They're too blurry, so I'm going to leave them out. And here I'm using some trapezoid shapes to create the placement for the flower in this piece of paper. And here I'm focusing mostly on the first one, and then I'm looking at the second one and the third one and the distance between them to determine how I'm going to place these three trapezoid shapes that will be flowers. And once I have that, I'm creating leaves and stems loosely based on the photo reference, because if you can see, they're not that much in focus. So I'm only focusing on the differences in colors that I'm seeing to determine where I'm going to place the stem for the flower part or the leaves that I would like to add. This is honestly optional because at the end I'm going to sketch them and shade them out very loosely. So if you want, you can leave that part out and only draw the petals and the tulips as a flower alone. And once I'm done with that, I'm confident with the placement. I'm going to start drawing petals for the first tulip. I'm starting with the one that I'm seeing on the left and the right side. They're fully visible from this angle, and I'm noticing that they have a gap between them. So I'm loosely sketching that out and noticing that at the top it has a bit of a pointy tip. So I'm keeping that also in the sketch because it will help me later on with inking. And for these ones that are in the middle, they're a bit trickier to draw. So I'm starting with the first one that I'm seeing well, that looks like a heart shape, and I'm sketching it out. And for the other ones that are overlapping a bit at the top of it, I'm looking at the distance and the rough shape for every single element that I'm seeing. Distance between these petals that I already drawn, and the distance between the overlapping elements. So I'm recreating that as best as I can possibly do. And once I'm happy with that, I'm adding those overlaps where you can notice that the petal is bent towards the center of the flower. You can go loosely on this and notice if you want to add anything. And for the other flower, I'm using the same principle, but I'm noticing that these two petals that I'm seeing first, one on the left and on the right side, they're overlapping a bit. So I'm keeping that in mind when I'm drawing them. First, I'm drawing the one that I'm seeing almost fully, and then I'm drawing the one that's in the background a bit, overlapping with the other one. And for the central petal in the middle, I'm using the same principle, outlining something that looks like a heart shape, a bit of a messy heart shape, but that's what it looks like to me. And for the third one, it's a bit blurry in the photo reference, but you can see that the petal looks like a teardrop, the one that I'm seeing almost fully. So I'm recreating that teardrop shape. And for the other ones, I'm using that same principle, but remembering how it looks in 3D. So I'm recreating some triangle shapes and trapezoid shapes to have that teardrop, but in another angle. And once I'm happy with all of that, I'm going to start inking. I'm using 0.3 for now, but later on I'm going to switch between 0.1 and 0.03. That was almost dead, so keep that in mind. You can do 0.5 for this part. And here I'm working with the sketch that I have for every single petal, outlining that part, But once I go close to the edge of the petal, actual petal, I'm noticing that in the photo reference it's a bit rougher and has a bit of a wave to it. So I'm recreating that in my sketch or an ink piece. So keep that in mind. You can, again, go with more of a neat line, but if you want to have a more organic shape, you can add a couple of wavy lines here and there. This is my personal preference because I do tend to have more messier approach to drawing all of these. And I'm doing that for every single petal that I'm seeing, for every flower. And sometimes because these tulips at the end of the petal, they do have a bit of a tip, I'm starting with that sometimes to keep it easier for drawing and outlining the outer edge with more of a straight line or, a sleeker type of line. And for the edges of these petals, I'm always focusing on more of that organic, messy shape for that line. And for the leaves, honestly, I'm basing them off of my memory and the color differences that I'm seeing in the photo reference. You can do that also. At the end, their leaves are pretty simple to draw because they do have that triangle-like shape to it. So you can do that and it'll be pretty good. And for the third one, I'm also working with things that I'm keeping in mind, creating a smoother outer edge, and then the inner parts are a bit messier, not too much. And once I do all of that, in the middle of these petals, I'm noticing some lines that I'm going to recreate in the middle of them in my sketch. And once I'm happy with all of that and I filled in some things that I missed, I'm going in with my technical pencil to start shading in the flower. Here I'm looking at those lines that I'm seeing on every single petal, and I'm trying to recreate them as best as possible, mostly focusing on the outer edge of the petal and then the outline of the flower that I've drawn already, keeping the middle part almost intact. But if you can see in the photo reference, all of these flowers have some lines, like a texture to the petals. So I'm trying to recreate that. It's a bit tricky. If you want, you can leave that out and only shade in the edge of the petal and the edge of the outline that you have drawn. And it'll create a pretty good effect even without these textural lines that the petal has. And for every single petal, I'm looking at the way these lines behave. If you notice near the tip, that pointed tip, it follows that line, and once you start going towards the bottom of the petal, it starts working in that way and moving the lines. Just like the leaves, petals also have that texture following the middle part and then going towards the edge of the petal. So for every single one, I'm doing that. And for the first flower, for those that are in the background, overlapping and leaning towards the center of the flower, it's a bit trickier. And in that case, I'm only going to focus on those parts that are the darkest in the photo reference. I'm not going to touch anything that's lighter, so I'm only going to focus on those parts that are significantly darker that I'm seeing and shading that part only. And in this case, you can really go as detailed as you want or as minimal as you prefer. This, at the end of the day, leads to your personal taste and also the level of details that you want to create in the sketch. I do tend to draw a lot of lines for shading, so if you want, you can follow this from start to finish and create as many lines as you can possibly do. I'm using a technical pencil because it gives me that level of precision, but you can also use a regular pencil or anything that you prefer for shading. If you want to add color, this could be really good because these flowers have several shades of color of this pink fuchsia and some blacker, darker parts and some really good highlights. So if you do that, please keep in mind to leave out those lighter shades and shading those darker areas a bit more to really make that stand out. But here I'm still using the technical pencil to follow the guidelines that I've made and shade in from the middle of the petal towards the edge of it, and then from the edge of the petal towards the center. Once I'm happy with the initial shading that could help me with my inking process, I'm using a thinner fineliner to shade in the details. You can do it with the same one, but I do prefer to use a slimmer fineliner for this purpose because I do tend to use a lot of lines for shading. So in this case, I'm working my way towards a bit of a darker shade for all of these flowers. And first, because these textural lines are definitely noticeable, I am starting to work with them first to outline them and shade them a bit more because they're really noticeable on these flowers. And once I'm happy with that, I'm starting to shade in the very bottom of the flower that's connecting to the stem because it is way darker than the rest of the flower. So I'm using a couple of lines following the outline of every single tulip to shade in those parts, and also the parts for the first and second flower where these two petals overlap or they look a bit close together. That middle part is almost black at this point, so I'm really shading that in well to make it stand out. And for the petals, I'm following the guidelines that I've created with my technical pencil, and I'm using that to fill in and add even more detail with a fineliner. I'm also focusing on the middle of those petals that have two lines that I created previously, and I'm shading that even more to really make that stand out in the sketch. And here you can go in and really shade everything with as many lines as you prefer, or again, keep it minimal and add a couple of them here and there, mostly from several points where you can really notice that it's way darker in the photo reference than in your sketch. So focusing on that, shading it in, and working from the edge of the petal towards the center and from the center of the petal towards the edge, leaving that tiny gap in between to have a bit of that highlight effect. And I'm switching here between some fineliners because I did notice that my thinnest one is drying out. So you will notice that I'm looking at the photo reference and shading in some parts even more than I did with a pencil because I do want to replicate all of that texture that I'm seeing in the photo reference. This is a really particular picture because when I started searching for tulips, a lot of them were too smooth and there wasn't enough texture for me to really show you how you can really make a lot of details if you want to. So this one was a perfect candidate for that. And here I am zooming in the photo reference to notice the details that every single flower has. You know, the first one has several textural lines and also that middle part that's really shaded in well, and it stands out really well in that central petal that's in the middle of it. And the one on the right side has that color difference that I'm trying to replicate in the sketch. And you know, with this, my tip would be to use a fineliner, and also if you prefer, you can do a mix of a fineliner and a pencil. You can do 6B or 8B pencil as well to really shade it in and create that really dark effect where you notice that it has more shading or more texture that's darker than the rest of the petal. So I'm doing that also on the second one. I'm noticing where I'm seeing that overlap between the flowers. I do tend to add a bit more shading near that overlap to make them stand out a bit more from each other so they don't really look so well blended in. Because, you know, the second one is in the background a bit, and I will shade in that part that's overlapping with the first flower. I'll shade it in a bit more to make the first one stand out. So only at the bottom right corner of the second flower, I'm creating a bit more shading. And for the petals, I do follow that same principle, outlining from the edge of the petal towards the center, from the center towards the edge or the outline in case of the first two that I've drawn. And for the middle one, I am looking at the ways these petals overlap and where I'm seeing a bit more of that shaded end part. So I'm replicating that as much as I can. And also I'm noticing a bit of that pointy end from another flower or the same flower that I added into my sketch, and I'm shading in that part also. For the third one, the same thing goes, shading the petals with that same principle, and also looking at the ways all of them overlap and the darker areas in the photo reference that I really want to make sure that it stands out well. So I'm sometimes fully shading it in to make it really dark. And for the petals, again, if I'm noticing that if there's a bit of an overlap, I do tend to shade that part in to make sure that it really stands out. And at the end, I'm taking a step back to really assess what I see and looking at some areas that are maybe needing some more attention. So in this stage, I'm looking at the shaded in areas and seeing if I want to add a couple of more lines to make it really stand out, to add a bit more of that dimension that I prefer. And for the leaves and the stem, honestly, I got too tired at this point, so I'm using a messy shading technique to see how I want to color it with a fineliner only. And here in the photo reference, I'm looking at these areas that are a bit darker. So on the left side of the stem, I'm only shading that part in, or when it's connecting to the flower, that part is usually darker, so I'm shading that in also. And for the leaves, because they're too blurry for me to gather any information, I'm only using some straight lines that follow that outline of the flower, and I'm shading that in fully. And after I assessed all of that, I wanted to use a pencil to really color it in all the way from the tip of the stem towards the end of every single leaf. So I went in and colored everything with a pencil to really make sure that it's fully shaded in, and in this case I did try to follow that color difference that I'm seeing in the photo reference, but in some cases I really didn't. I just shaded the entire leaf and that was it for this part. If you want, you can find another photo reference looking at the leaves only and seeing how you want to draw them. In this case, they're pretty simple, so you won't have a lot of details. Maybe I had a couple of lines at the top and the bottom and that would be it. But for this purpose, a pencil will do. So once I'm happy with that, I do want to add a couple of more lines with a fineliner when I'm noticing that I want to shade it in a bit more, mostly from the edge of or the tip of the leaf and the bottom part that I'm seeing to add some dimension, and also parts where I'm noticing that it's overlapping or behind the flower to make sure that the flower can really stand out well, and also on these parts where it's connecting to the flower at the bottom of it. So I'm shading that in with a fineliner a bit more to add more details and clean that part because I made a mess, to be honest. So once I'm happy with all of that, the drawing is complete. And here's my final interpretation of drawing these tulips. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, give it a thumbs up and comment down below. Let me know what you think about it. If you have any ideas or suggestions or any questions, I'm here to help. And as you can see, we had a couple of steps from the basic guidelines with some rough shapes to outline the placement, and then working towards the carving out of the shape for every single petal, and then creating that minimal line art with a fineliner, and then finally shading everything in with super high level of detail, Saskolinas style, to create the final drawing. I do hope that you found this video useful, and if you create these drawings, please tag me on socials. Everywhere I'm Saskolinas, so you can find me on most of these places. Tag me, I would like to see this. I'm really happy when I see your recreations. You can't imagine how much. So thanks for watching. If you made it this far, subscribe for more videos, of course, because I do plan to create some more drawing tutorials and this style, so stay tuned. And as always, thanks for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye!